This is the first meeting of the Campus Workers Collective. My name's Terry Fritter. I'd like to thank a few people before we get started. I'd like to thank Linda Thau and John Leese from the University Staff Shared Governance for helping support this. I'd like to also thank Vice Chancellor, Interim Vice Chancellor Lehman, and now Vice Chancellor Lauren Heller for allowing this to happen, and certainly for the work that's done all the time for our IT sound and recording. What we're trying to do here is bring information to the university staff that we generally don't get. You know, as it says here, educate, inform, uplift. Let people know that there's been people struggling and trying to, in the same position as us through the years. They're just, some things just fun to make us know that we are appreciated on the campus. And just a little history on yesterday in 1913, 700,000 steel workers went out on strike. Always a little labor education if we can get it. So we decided on Sacco and Vanzetti because we thought it pertained to a lot of what's happening in this country today. The attack on any aliens who come into this country in the 1920, the Palmer raids, where they're deporting people, many Italians, for their political beliefs, which seems to tie into what we have today. So we looked at that and thought this would be something that maybe would be good for people to hear again and what happened during that time. So my personal heroes, Emma Goldman was deported in 1919 to Russia for her stance on the First World War. A couple of weeks, last week, in 1918, Eugene Victor Debs was in prison, federal prison, for being against World War I, being a pacifist. So what's happening today isn't anything that hasn't happened in our past. So today we're lucky enough to have a fantastic speaker who's the Assistant Professor of European History, Giuliana Chamedes. And here we go. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks so much, Terry, for this introduction. I'm going to stand, I think, away from the mic because I think we're a small enough group. So, first of all, I just want to say that I'm really humbled to have been invited. The collective is doing amazing work. I should. Okay, I'm sorry. I just feel funny standing in front of the mic. Anyway, as I was saying, I'm really happy to be here and to try to support in this very small way with my talk the work that workers on this campus are doing, the amazing organizing that you're doing, and this new organization, the Campus Workers Collective, which I hope everyone keeps their eyes on. There's a University Staff Congress coming up on October 17th that I hope many of you can attend. So as I'm setting up, I'm going to talk to you today about Sacco and Vanzetti. Hopefully we'll get it up here. Oops, not from there. Just a sec, sorry. So as you were coming in, hopefully you saw pictures and music already connected to these two Italian-American activists and labor organizers, Sacco and Vanzetti, who I'll be talking with you about today. So thank you again to John Leese, to Terry Fritter, to Linda Thau, and to the Campus Workers Collective. Nicola Sacco was 29 years old when he and a friend of his, Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were stopped and arrested on a streetcar. They were in the city of Brockton in Massachusetts. It was May 5th, 1920. Later, quite a bit later in fact, the duo learned that one police officer's hunch was the reason for their arrest on the streetcar. This officer had been asked to investigate a murder which involved the Slater and Morrill Shoe Company in South Braintree, Massachusetts. At this shoe company, the paymaster and the guard had been murdered in mid-April of 1920. And according to this one police officer, the hunch was that the murder must have been the work of local immigrant anarchists. So let me tell you a little bit about these two men who were, in fact, local immigrant anarchists. Nicola Sacco had been living in the US for 12 years. He's the man arm in arm with his wife there. Sacco was born and raised in southern Italy in the province of Foggia. His father had a lot of olive orchards and vineyards, and he became a lover of the great outdoors. He married Rosa Zambelli after moving to the United States. This picture of her is not that flattering, so I found another one right here. So this is Rosa Zambelli. The two met in Massachusetts, and Sacco started working in a shoe factory and gradually started accumulating some money in the bank. Both he and Rosa got active in politics. First, they were socialists, and then they became anarchists. And they took an active role in a series of strikes in the Boston area, putting on some plays in Italian neighborhoods to raise money for strike relief. 2 years after marrying, the couple had a son. They named him Dante. And when Sacco was arrested on May 5th of 1920, his wife Rosa was actually pregnant, and she would give birth a few months later when Sacco was already in prison. Sacco would spend 7 years in prison before being put to the electric chair and executed. Being far away from his family was very difficult for him, and it was very difficult for him to stay cooped up indoors because, again, he was an outdoors man. On top of that, because of a technical rule, which had to do with the handling of unsentenced prisoners charged with murder, Sacco did not have the option of physical labor while he was in prison. He was not allowed to work. So he was basically forced into a condition of unemployment, and he really struggled to adapt to this environment. His English was okay when he entered prison. He could read English, he could understand it well, but he could not write well. And for a few years, he just fell into a depression and wasn't quite sure what to do with himself while in prison, forced indoors, and unemployed. But ultimately, 2 years into the ordeal, he of his own accord decided that he was going to improve his English. So he asked prison guards for an English dictionary, and he wrote his first letter in English in 1922. Eventually, he would write hundreds of letters from prison, both to his family members and his friends, and to his supporters around the world. His written English was still not great, but I'd encourage you all, if you're interested in this story, to check out his published letters in English. He used to say that if he had started learning to write in English outside of the prison, he would have learned in a week. But since he was learning in prison, his written English didn't improve that quickly. The second figure who was arrested on that streetcar in May of 1920 was Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were friends. Vanzetti was a very different kind of character. He picked up English much faster than Sacco. He came from a middle-class farming family in northern Italy, and from a very early age, he was a serious writer. He loved writing. He loved reading. He loved studying. And when he started working in northern Italy in the major industrial city of Turin as a pastry cook, he got into radical social theory. He moved to the United States at the age of 20 and started working again as a cook. But because employment wasn't stable and because there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, he had to move around quite a bit. So he worked in the brickyards in Springfield, Massachusetts, and he worked also as an ice cutter and as a fish peddler. He also got active in local labor struggles and joined an Italian-American anarchist organization in Massachusetts called Gruppo Nuovo, which just means new group. Vanzetti was arrested at the age of 31. In 1920, he was 31. And he quickly gained a reputation among prison guards and wardens as the guy who never stops reading and never stops writing. So he joined Sacco in the writing of many, many letters. So the men were up on trial, and they were tried in 1921, and the jury very quickly decided that the duo was guilty of first-degree murder. This was despite the fact that the trial itself, by all accounts, had been a complete mess. There were instances of recanted testimony. There were conflicting ballistic evidence, pieces of ballistic evidence. Someone else even confessed to the crime. But thus notwithstanding, the two were found guilty. In the meanwhile, a Sacco and Vanzetti defense committee, and this is just one of the many, many flyers that they circulated, the Sacco and Vanzetti defense committee, which had been founded by an Italian-American anarchist, took up the defense of the men, and this committee tried to get the court decision appealed. But the trial judge, Judge Webster Thayer, and eventually even the Massachusetts State Supreme Court, to which the case was brought, all of these denied the appeals. So ultimately, the men spent 7 years in prison and were then executed. Over the course of these 7 years, Sacco and Vanzetti would, in their letters, present themselves as innocent of the crime that they were accused of having committed. They also consistently, in their letters, argued that what had happened to them happened because they were radical labor organizers and because they were anarchists. Just a very quick word on anarchism, and then I want to tell you about the huge mobilizations that formed in support of these two men around the world. So anarchism, is often associated with kind of crazy bomb-throwing people, but in fact, anarchism was and is a real serious political ideology that came into its own in the late 19th century. Anarchists were committed to a vision of worker solidarity that cut across national boundaries, that cut across nation states, and anarchists had a common vision of a future without the state. A fundamental defining feature of anarchist thought was that they were anti-statists. They saw the state as one very important source of oppression of the individual and of the collective. And they were committed to the autonomy and freedom of the individual and to worker rights. Anarchists were also strongly anti-capitalist, and they believed that a popular revolution was necessary and justified in order to overthrow capitalism. But they, unlike many strands of communism, for instance, they didn't believe that the revolution would come about through the laws of history. They thought you would have to actually create it yourself. Anarchists also had a vision of the future to come, the future good society, as one that would be founded on voluntary acts of cooperation at the local level. It's what a Russian anarchist, a famous Russian anarchist called Peter Kropotkin, called a society of mutual aid. Okay, so Sacco and Vanzetti were in the prison writing hundreds of letters in which they remained unwavering in their commitment to anarchism and unwavering in their commitment to labor struggles. And meanwhile, outside of the prison, a huge movement was forming in support of these two immigrant labor activists. Workers were organizing demonstrations that were huge in support of Sacco and Vanzetti. So this is just one of hundreds of photos that I could have picked for you of workers in solidarity with Sacco and Vanzetti demonstrating in Boston in the 1920s. It wasn't just Boston, though, that was active. There were huge demonstrations in New York, in Chicago, in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires, in Montevideo, in Caracas, in Paris, in Marseille, in Rome, in Milan, in Turin, in Geneva, in Sydney, Australia, in Casablanca, Morocco, and the list goes on. Workers got together, they organized vigils for Sacco and Vanzetti. They printed up cheap pamphlets to inform the public about who these people were and why they were a cause worth rallying around. And a whole series of new worker organizations and worker collectives took shape and got stronger in the course of these mobilizations. And I'll just flag one, the French CGT, the Confédération Générale du Travail, which some of you may have heard of, because recently in the past few months, this union was the one that essentially brought France to a standstill in protest of recent labor laws pushed forward by the French president, François Hollande. Okay. So this new organization and many others were rallying around Sacco and Vanzetti, and it's worth noting that the people who were rallying around Sacco and Vanzetti in the 1920s in the four corners of the world, they were not just anarchists. They were not just Italian immigrants. They were people of various political persuasions. People on the radical left, communists, and radical socialists. They were moderate socialists. They were moderate liberals. The wave of organizing that swept the world had workers unquestionably at the forefront of the demonstrations. But some big name folks who were not workers or blue-collar workers joined the movement too. People like Albert Einstein came out strongly in favor of Sacco and Vanzetti. So did Marie Curie, the woman who developed the theory of radioactivity and went on to be the first woman to win the Nobel Prize. Artists also came out in huge number in support of Sacco and Vanzetti. People like Diego Rivera, the Mexican artist, and Ben Shahn. This is a Ben Shahn mural in Syracuse, New York, depicting the two men and those protesting on their behalf. Writers also joined the cause, people like H.G. Wells, George Bernard Shaw, and a novelist and journalist whose name is Malcolm Cowley, some of you may know, who was living in France in the 1920s. And he had this to say. He witnessed huge demonstrations in Paris in the 1920s that were bringing up to 75,000 people to the street to protest on behalf of what was presented as a travesty of justice. And what Cowley said was that the Sacco and Vanzetti taught united political action. It also taught that intellectuals, who he considered himself one of course, learned that they were powerless by themselves and that they could not accomplish anything unless they made an allegiance with the working class. So these huge demonstrations were taking place, and the first demand that they were putting forward was that there should be a retrial, because the first trial had been full of these errors that basically the two had not been conclusively demonstrated as guilty. But the demonstrations did not lead to a retrial. And in fact, the mobilizations actually hardened positions against Sacco and Vanzetti in positions of power. And many decided that it would actually be a sign of weakness to bow to what was effectively now international pressure and show leniency towards Sacco and Vanzetti in any way. So, for instance, the chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, William E. Bora, put it this way, quote, "It would be a national humiliation, a shameless, cowardly compromise of national courage to pay the slightest attention to foreign protest." And the historical evidence suggests that it was, in fact, the responses like these and conversations like these that helped harden the decision to execute Sacco and Vanzetti as opposed to simply keeping them in prison. On August 23rd of 1927, after having been in prison for 7 years, Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. Sacco was killed first. When he walked into the death chamber, he did so without hesitation, according to the reports of the assembled witnesses. He took his seat in the electric chair, and he said a few words before dying. First, he shouted in Italian, "Viva l'anarchia," long live anarchy. And then, more quietly and in English, in broken English, he said farewell to his wife, to his kids, and to his friends. Then he turned to the people who were assembled as witnesses of his execution, and he said, "Good evening, gentlemen." And then finally, as the hood was being slipped over his head, he whispered, "Arrivederci, mamma," farewell to his mother. A few moments later, Vanzetti was brought in. He was also calm. He shook hands with all of the prison guards assembled in the room and shook hands with the prison warden. And then he sat down, again, of his own account, without being asked to do so, in the electric chair. Before he was strapped in, he said, "I wish to tell you that I am an innocent man. I never committed any crime, but sometimes I have sinned." Then he said what would be his final words, which were, "I wish to forgive some people for what they are now doing to me." Sacco and Vanzetti were then immortalized through these death masks. Okay, so now we get to the question, what can we learn from this story? And in order to answer that question properly, I want to give you a little bit more information about US and world history in the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s. I'm going to move pretty fast because I'd like to have you all have your meeting. So, after World War I, there was a huge upsurge in political activism and labor mobilization around the world. There were also a series of radical left-wing revolutions, including the probably most famous one in Russia. But there were many other radical left-wing revolutions, both in Europe and in Latin America, right after World War I. In Sacco and Vanzetti's native Italy, for example, in a 2-year period, 1919-1920, workers in Turin, Milan, and elsewhere seized control of factories and started worker-run labor experiments. Peasants also seized control of land and effectively took that land away from their landlords. Many of them were still living in semi-feudal situations. In the United States, labor organizing was on the rise, and anarchists were really crucial in this story. Anarchists were crucial in the organizing of German crafts workers close by in Chicago. They were important in the immigrant-dominated clothing and garment trades, including, for instance, in the Amalgamated Clothing Workers and in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Now, anarchists and other radical labor organizers were able to put down roots and think of a whole series of new creative ways to organize. So, for instance, they didn't just organize on the shop floor, they organized in local gymnasiums, in singing societies, in fraternal halls, in so-called free schools, which had been established in the 19th century by socialists and freethinkers. And they started publishing and writing. They produced a lot to read, including newspapers on all kinds of topics, not just on politics, but on culture and literature, and on, daily life questions, what to eat, what sort of sexual practices to engage in, etc. So, after this upsurge of activism, radical left-wing labor activism, between 1917 and 1920 came a pretty dark decade, the decade of the 1920s. 1920 was the year, of course, also when Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested. As you just heard from Terry, in the US, the Palmer raids attacked specifically immigrant organizers and deported them in large numbers. And over the course of the 1920s, income inequality became really staggering in the United States. So even though over the course of the 1920s, worker productivity was on the rise and had grown, in fact, by 43% over the course of the 1920s, wages for workers stayed low, and the richest 1% kept getting richer. They earned about 12 to 19% of the total income earned by everyone else in the United States by the end of the 1920s. Also in the 1920s, politics lurched to the right. This was true in the United States, and it was also true in Europe and Latin America, where, for instance, in Italy, the right-wing dictator Mussolini came to power in 1922. A right-wing dictator came to power in Spain in the same years, et cetera, et cetera. Corporate power in the 1920s was also on the rise. The number of wealthy corporations was shrinking in the 1920s, and they were getting wealthier and wealthier. And then in 1929, 2 years after Sacco and Vanzetti were executed, the stock market crashed. Unemployment, which had already been high, skyrocketed around the world. In the United States, 25% of Americans were unemployed. 1/4 of Americans were unemployed. Living standards were at an all-time low. And after this decade of xenophobia, of worker repression, of deportation, of the consolidation of big banks and big businesses, the labor movement, it seemed, was at an all-time low. Or was it? In fact, the international labor mobilizing that had developed to protest Sacco and Vanzetti's case over the course of the 1920s stayed alive. This was a rank and file type of mobilization. It wasn't led by the big unions. And in the early 1930s, rank and file workers joined forces again. Again, many of the people who took part in the mobilization were immigrants. They were Chicano, Caribbean American, Eastern European. Many were minorities in the United States. For instance, African Americans played a huge role. In 1933, the Detroit auto plants went on strike. For those who were not in the labor movement and not paying attention, this seemed like a totally out of the blue event, but in fact, I don't think it was. So in 1933, the Detroit auto plants went on strike. The strikes spread very fast. This is a strike in Minneapolis. In the South, textile mills went on strike. In the East, coal miners went on strike. In the Midwest, Midwestern steel mills went on strike. And in 1934, there were 3 huge urban general strikes. In San Francisco, led by the longshore workers. In Minneapolis, led by the Teamsters. And in Toledo, which was led by auto part workers. And all of these 3 general strikes were successful. The workers got the demands that they put forward. How did they do it? They basically did what they had done during the Sacco and Vanzetti case. They reached out. They reached out to citizens. They reached out to writers and intellectuals. They created councils. They got creative about how to educate people. And finally, and most importantly, they were fearless. So in the words of one of the founders of the ACLU, which I saw on the Campus Workers Collective website, in the words of Roger Baldwin, quote, "Silence never won rights. They are not handed down. Rights are not handed down from above. They are forced by pressures from below." And I think the 1930s demonstrations really showed that. Now, workers not only won the immediate demands that they were making of their employers as a result of these huge mobilizations, they also pushed the United States as a whole to the left. So initially, when these strikes broke out in the 1930s, President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president at the time, did nothing. He ignored the strikes. He let companies and local repressive forces take the lead in crushing the workers. But then, as the strikes were getting bigger and winning local successes, essentially the president could no longer ignore them, and neither could the Democratic Party. So under pressure from tightly organized rank-and-file workers, Roosevelt pushed forward things like the Social Security Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which of course set maximum hours and minimum wages for most workers across the United States. FDR also enacted the Wagner Act, which set up collective bargaining as a routine practice, and it extended union recognition. So, back to the question of what we can learn from this story, and I'm going to close. I think there are many lessons that we can learn, but I'm going to focus on 3. The workers won in the 1930s for 3 big reasons. First of all, they did not give up. The 1920s were very dark years, but even in these dark years, millions of workers around the whole world showed their solidarity with Sacco and Vanzetti and showed their unity with one another. This work, I think, helped pave the way for the early 1930s labor upsurge, and it helped pave the way for the huge victories, including at the level of government policy in the United States, connected to worker rights and Social Security. So lesson number 1 from this history is don't give up even in the dark times. In fact, don't give up especially in the dark times. Second of all, I think the workers won in the 1930s because they embraced internationalism. What do I mean by that? The workers embraced the idea of working across borders. They believed in a global labor movement, and even more importantly, they helped create that global labor movement that was aware of what workers around the world were doing and was not overly invested in national differences from one national context to the next. Another way in which workers embraced internationalism in the 1920s and 1930s was by welcoming immigrants within the ranks of rank-and-file worker organizing. In the US, immigrants brought new ideas, new energies, new organizing tactics. both in their struggle for Sacco and Vanzetti and in their mobilizing that led up to the big 1930s strikes. So this embrace of internationalism and of diversity, we might say, to use a little bit of an anodyne term. But anyway, this embrace of internationalism is the second big takeaway from this story, I think. Number 3, and this is my last point, the 1920s and 1930s mobilizations worked because workers stayed united. Remember, these were rank and file workers, and for periods in the 1920s in the US, big unions actually couldn't do much of anything at all. So in a sense, it was really up to the rank and file workers to mobilize, and they did. These were grassroots protests, the ones of the 20s and 30s. Unity also mattered in terms of building bridges outside of the obvious worker movement with writers and artists and, in some cases, intellectuals. But of course, workers remained the central driving force of these struggles, and the working class was asserting its independence and unity, and the conviction that workers were themselves the ones who were best equipped to represent their own interests. And they encouraged this unity, this sense of solidarity, by disseminating literature, holding gatherings, hosting free schools, providing everything from basic literacy training to conversations about political theory and history. Okay, so perseverance, internationalism, and unity. To me, these are the big lessons of the Sacco and Vanzetti case and of the successful wave of worker mobilizations of the 1920s and 1930s. The mobilizations that ultimately in the US were able to provide workers with a set of legal guarantees which of course of late have been stripped away and which I think we need to fight to continue to protect by pushing the envelope, by thinking big, and by staying strong and united. Thank you. Thanks to all the great work that you do.
Does anybody take a few questions if there are any? Okay. Does anybody have any questions or remarks for the assistant professor? That was inspiring. All right, well, thank you very much. Oh.
I'd just like to say one thing. I think it's kind of what I find most interesting is the crowds with the difference in, like they didn't have social media or, all of that. And like when we think about the Capitol, when the protests happened, we had a lot of resources available to us to organize that were instantaneous, where this would have taken weeks of preparation.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And I think it's both really inspiring and also a helpful lesson that ultimately there's nothing like face-to-face communication. So in the process of, building even the newspapers that circulated, you had, individuals who were reaching out. And again, the ways of getting out this information were very, very varied. There was no moment in the 1920s where there was, for instance, an exclusive reliance on just newspapers or something like that. Yeah, but that's a great point.
Or maybe we could learn a lesson if we went back to more of that, and we would have a more united front.
Maybe.
When you talk about internationalism, are you talking about, is this about the same time you're talking about the Wobblies, IWW?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's what we use.
Yeah, and the Wobblies, in the U.S. and around the world were one of the leading organizations that was, truly open to immigrants in a way that was not the case for many of the other organizations in the U.S. that considered themselves on the left or even the radical left. So they were really pioneering in that respect.
Did you ever find out who committed the crime?
No, it's still very much up for debate. I decided to not make my talk primarily about that, but if you'd like, I can recommend, about 40 books that are still debating this question. The ballistics evidence was inconclusive. So ultimately, I think we won't know. Yeah.
I'm John Lee, Secretary of the University Staff, and we were allotted 45 minutes for this meeting, so we've reached that almost exactly. So I'm sure that the professor will also greet you as we conclude this as well, if you want to talk to her personally. On your way out, at the back of the room, thanks to our friends like Rich Gasson at Digital Printing and Publishing Services, there's a commemorative card here for the Sacco Vanzetti event with a poem on the back that you can pick up on the way out. Take as many as you like if you want to pass them around to your coworkers. And I also want to note for anybody who has questions about University Staff Shared Governance, the chair of the University Staff Shared Governance Central Committee, Jake Rebholz, is right in the back there. So Jake, you have to wave so they know who to talk to. Yeah, there he is. So thank you again very much. Let's have another round of applause for our speaker this afternoon.